This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, and ideas from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Connect with us to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I am your host, Jamie Wood, and our topic today is pricing power plays. Now, in my observation, there's probably no greater source of angst for your average wholesale media sales professional than the subject of price. Clients are price sensitive and typically want to negotiate rates down. Media companies are price sensitive, typically want to drive the rates up. Sales teams are very much focused on driving revenue volume and driving market share. Then you've got internal pricing teams, inventory management teams who are primarily focused on rate and yield. Now that is an overly simplified kind of summary of the whole sort of, let's say, value chain, if you will. But the reality is there are opposing forces at play here. There are opposing processes, conflicting KPIs, different objectives. And what happens as a consequence of that is a good old thing I like to call process conflict, which is when you have a misalignment that manifests as conflict, interpersonal or otherwise. So what do? Well, one thing we want to do is we want to understand and unpack the world of pricing a little better, and we want to get an understanding of what's really going on here. So our returning guest today is Mr. Adam Lang. Adam has a very unique perspective on this particular subset of media sales for a couple of reasons. One, he is a former CEO of an ASX-listed media company. Number two, he has worked in revenue management, inventory management, pricing functions before as well. And number three, he's just got a very strong, very general, broad commercial acumen. Obviously, he's one of the co-creators and sometimes co-hosts of the daily podcast Fear and Greed. He is also newly appointed as the publisher of Mumbrella, which is a trade media publication in the Australian market. Probably, I would argue, is the leading one in the Australian market. So was really keen to get into this with Adam and get right into the weeds, get very hyper-specific on this very particular subset of media sales, in the hope that you might walk away with a little bit of an understanding of what's really at play here, and you can apply that to your role moving forward. So let's get into it now.
The first five.
Adam, welcome back.
Thank you, Jamie. It's good to be with you again.
Well, I was going to ask you to give us a quick overview of your experience in media and what you're currently doing, and it's a momentous day in the world of Mumbrella. What's the exciting news today that you want to share?
Well, I've been appointed as publisher of Mumbrella, so I guess, to the history part, best part of 3 decades in media, from music to television to radio, now digital audio, but also been working for the last 12 weeks with Mumbrella on the editorial side, and have been appointed as publisher as at today. So that means taking responsibility for the running of the team, and that includes events, it includes the editorial of the daily newsletter and the website, and the commercial side of the operations too. So it's a team of about 20, and we're spread out as businesses can be. Most of it's in Sydney, some in Melbourne, some working remotely. But the business is really about connecting everyone with everything that's relevant under the umbrella of media and marketing. And so we want to help people get better at their jobs. So they should be able to come to us for the information, the news that's breaking, how to do things, what campaigns are working, what clients are moving. So if you're a media buyer, you're a creative, you're a PR communications person, or a media operator, you should be able to come to us and get information that helps you do your job.
I love that. I think that's such a great summation of what Mumbrella is, and certainly Mumbrella Cast, which you and I have spoken about, which is your podcast offering, of which you are a co-host, has been really, really good to listen to lately, mate. I think it's not surface level headlines. It's a lot of deep analysis. It's a lot of opinion, but I'm really enjoying listening to it, and I think it's probably what spawned me to get you back onto the podcast to talk about this topic, because this whole idea of pricing power plays, as I've called it, there's a tension that exists with every frontline seller around pricing, particularly in the trading environment we're currently in. And from the perspective of a former CEO, but also someone who I know has led revenue ops, pricing and yield teams in the past, tell me, why, at a high level, why is a focus on maintaining rate integrity, and why is growing yield just so important to a media organisation?
It can be the difference between being profitable or not. beating your competitors or not, and being able to hire more people or not. Really, that's what it comes down to. If you think that the normal operations of a company, they need a certain cost base, and the revenue that you hope to gain will cover that and then some. It'll cover the cost of operation plus profit. And really, that's where your ability to invest in research and development, invest in new roles and changing and experimentation, it all comes out of profit. And the right pricing structure, the right rate integrity in this conversation, it is not an easy thing to master. There are so many parts pulling at price in a negotiation. But in the end, if you can do your bit for that, your company will be more profitable. You'll be doing your job better. And I think that leads to more successful teams. And I see it as that important.
Media Sales Mastery.
Great setup for the main topic, because I just want to start at the beginning. Like, how does a media sales professional actually sit down and interpret a company rate card? Like, what are some of the things you might advise a new rep sort of do to just better understand maybe what the pricing strategy is of a company that they're working for?
Always think on your customer's behalf, and you've got to be the translator between your company's assets and what they need to do, the objectives that they have and the goals they want to meet. So we can choose any number of examples, a retailer, an event. It could be a brand that needs enhancing or relevance. Think on their behalf. And they obviously want to reach people to tell them about what their brand is doing. And so there'll be a mix of different objectives. Some might be time-bound sales issues. Some might be longer-term branding and brand affinity, but really thinking on behalf of your customers. So think on behalf of that brand and what they need to make their company and their brand successful. So they will tell you that, but then you've got to be able to connect that desire and those goals to the assets that your company has. So in a media company, how is your audience going to respond to a message in a way that's going to align with those goals? And of course, you establish those bona fides, those credentials, if you will, but then you've also got to make sense of that in terms of a price. So how are we helping you reach that audience? With what frequency? What reach? What message are we going to have, or range of messages are we going to have? What formats are we going to use? And how do we price all of those in a way that those two parties can get together and say, yeah, that transaction makes absolute sense?
Yeah, and you touched on a good point, which was going to be sort of my follow-up question, which was we might have an understanding as to why the company wants to increase yield, or why we're trying to be maybe the price leader in the market, or why we're pricing at a premium. What about when it comes to actually flipping that and positioning that in market to a customer? So how do we put into context, for a client, rather than what's important to us, how do we sort of position, rate increases, certain premium pricing, our pricing strategy in general? How do you sort of externally communicate what that looks like to a customer in a way that they can interpret?
There's some really fundamental propositions that you have to do at the very beginning, and I think that goes in part to your former question and this one, Jamie, and that's around the scale of audience that you can reach, at what times and places, how often. Those demographics and those numbers, those quantities are really important. You've got to understand your audience and how you're reaching them at various points. And so the scale of that is a really important determiner of value, how much you can charge. And obviously, the bigger your audience is, the more relevant your audience is, the more you can charge. But that all means that all has to be translated back into price. So it is not true to say that only the big audiences can price. Everyone can price. There's a right price for any single exchange. Above and beyond that, I think it's really about context and who your audience is. What are the sort of people that you're trying to reach? Why do we help you reach them? Where are they going to be when they hear it? What are they going to be thinking of, as they listen to or read or watch the environment that you create? What are they going to be thinking of, and how will that creative message get across in the best possible way? And so you have in that part, I think I'm trying to delineate, there is the numeric side of this, and then there is the non-numeric, which is much more about, hey, anyone can reach an audience, a number, but not everyone can reach the same audience at the same time in the same way. That they all come to our media brands for a reason. There's a connection to that brand, whether they watch, listen, read, that they want to be there and they're listening to something, they're watching something, they're reading something in a certain context. So you know that environment better than anyone. And how does that value come through in the exchange you're talking about? Not just the numbers, the cost per thousands, reach, frequency, but the context, the timing, and how will that create a better reaction for the campaign? Why will this investment in this company and this audience be different to another? And how will that work better for the company? How will that work better for the brand?
Such a good point that you raised there, mate, which everything you're talking about there, I try to delineate a lot of the time between objective value, CPM, discount rate, the spreadsheet metrics, if you will, versus what you were talking about there, which is not so much subjective value, but it's about relevance to the customer and what's important to them, isn't it? It's like, it's not about unit price necessarily, it's about quality of audience, it's about context, it's about their potential to act upon the message, a higher concentration of your ideal target market. All of these things factor in to it as well. And I do wonder whether, sort of in the next question I had, what's usually driving a client's motivation to discuss a discount in a media transaction? Because these requests for lower rates, to me, they often feel like a consequence of something being missing from the equation, more so than it just being about price.
So if I think of their customers in mind, a media buyer or someone in control of their budget for their client, or even if they work in-house, of course, their masters are under pressure. Get me more for less every year, and really I think that's become tradition. I don't know that it should be the only tradition. In fact, I think it should not be. Really it should be, how do I create better reaction to my campaigns? How do I get more people to switch on to the benefits I believe are in the brand? How do I get more people to be aware of that? Not just, I want to spend less and make more. It's like, it's a bit hollow and it's probably a bit fanciful just to think that way, right? And it also tends to remove from the process, rather conveniently, the humanity of it, right? In the end, people are reading, people are watching, people are listening. They're just, they're in a different environment. They've only got a certain amount of time in their day to think about certain things. They're reading or watching or listening to our media because they want that in their life, right? So it could be relief, it could be information, it could be to get educated on something. But they're there for a reason, and to speak to them about your brand in that context. And so I would love it if that was as much a part of the conversation. How do we make your brand even more relevant in this context than just price? Because I think price alone, yes, I understand the economic pressure. I'd really like to spend less on running my business. I'd really like to make more profit. But can you just do that in the form of a lower CPM? Thanks. It just doesn't feel like it's enough. And it's certainly not enough for each party to gain from it. So I totally understand where it's coming from. And I totally understand why it exists and the rich history we have of rate negotiations. We've been in these sorts of conversations for a long time. They always happen. We should be prepared for them. But they are too singularly dimensional to cover the whole range of the trading that needs to happen. And they don't seem to enough encompass the end result, the return on investment. And so that has to be within the domain of these conversations as well. So look, I'm sure we'd all love to buy a brand new car at a cheaper price, but maybe we can't. That's what they've decided to sell at. So you've got the option of buying a cheaper one or not, So there's all sorts of factors that come into it. I think that price alone can't cut it. It has to come under the banner of return on investment. And ideally, the most exciting conversations I've been in are the ones that are brands that want to grow. And that's a really good challenge, not just related to price.
There's a real art to it. I think in my observation, and this is, some observations I've made of different sales teams around the world in the last 4 months. Some reps, the reps who are really successful, are really good at what I would call kind of decommoditizing the sale, right? And it's that old cliche of, they're coming in, having a meaningful business conversation, they're using their commercial acumen, they're using their emotional intelligence, they're having an awareness of the external trading environment they're operating in. And the conversation they're having is rarely about how do I get you more spots for less. It's around what does success look like in your business and how do I build something that can actually deliver that to you. And what's difficult about that, mate, is it's not something that can necessarily be taught as a part of a sales process, because it's actually a composite of all these different skills and experience and a level of awareness that, you know, these people have obviously just spent time developing and curating to get to that point.
It's so true. And you know that probably outside the two people in the conversation you might be exemplifying here is there are businesses. This knowledge exists, right, within each business. You know, so whomever is behind the brand that we're talking about in this negotiation, they will want to grow. I mean, unless there's something stunning, some external event or something that we can't predict. It's almost like a default position. The brand would want to grow, you know, because really that's the secret, right? You want to keep winning and you want to keep growing. That has to exist as some of the drivers in the conversation. It's not just about price or about an individual campaign. It has to be about growth. And in the media company that we might be referencing here, you know, they don't just want this transaction to be successful. They want this client to look at the end of each campaign and going, hey, that worked, that we might change, that didn't, but we want to keep partnering with you because we know we can make this work better. It has to be an ongoing conversation, not just a one-off transaction.
It's sort of contrast against the backdrop of the company you work for, the media company, also wanting to grow, and rate increases being a massive part of that. So here's what I've always found interesting around rate increases. Most reps wouldn't, I'm going to go ahead and say, they might be aware of the need to protect rate integrity. They might be very passionate about growing yield, but they're not necessarily KPI'd, you know, on that. They're very much rewarded often on volume of revenue and share of revenue. And so oftentimes you can see a little bit of friction that comes up in the transaction when they're trying to negotiate a rate increase, when ultimately what they're about is bringing in the volume, bringing in the share. So what are some things that would be worth a media sales professional maybe like understanding about rate increases? And what I mean by that is, what's in it for a media sales professional to have an eye on yield and to constantly be trying to push that rate card up as well?
Such a good point. And I must say that the best operators that I've had the experience of dealing with, they do care about that. It's like if you are making Coca-Cola, your cost of goods sold matters. You know, if you are looking at media sales, the cost of inventory used matters. Time is finite. I haven't found a way to disrupt the space-time continuum. You know, there's only a certain amount of inventory that you have, right? So, you know, and in the sort of oldest models, media salespeople didn't care how much time they sold to get the result they wanted. Now, that might work for an individual, a client, a budget, but it doesn't work for a team. And you've run teams, Jamie. You've done it very successfully for some time, and you know that the team has to win, right? It can't be just the individuals. And so if you know that someone's getting access to rates that you don't, it can be corrupting. It can be really toxic in a team. And so for the company to make a decision on, just like that Coca-Cola, hey, we're not going to sell this at any price. You want the product. There are certain parameters that we have to adhere to. The same thing I would really advocate should be for inventory. We've got to be sure it works for our clients. We've got to be sure it works for our business. Otherwise, they both won't exist. One of them's going to stop, right? So, you know, the aspect of, I guess, senior sales management and running a good team is helping people to understand it's not just the amount of inventory consumed. In the end, that does not create the best result. You know, hearing an audience member hearing too many of a set of ads, you know, with the greatest deference to the client and their wishes, they may say that more is more, right? But actually it can be damaging. It does reach a point of fatigue. And so, you know, endless frequency shouldn't be the objective, and therefore endless amounts of time shouldn't be the main consideration. And in a team environment, I don't think media operators have got the scope to trade that way anymore. I think you've got to have a better appreciation for your audience, your teams, and the product that you put out. And just selling lots cheap doesn't work for anybody. And I think that means that the company has to develop its DNA, what it's willing to trade with the market, because they have to be the custodians of the audience in total, so that each of the brand's marketing come through and it still sounds great to the audience. Otherwise, it'll be diminished.
Hey, this is Jamie. Thank you for listening to this podcast all around pricing power plays. As I mentioned in the intro, there are 2 podcasts that are very much incorporating into your audio diet in conjunction with Media Sales Mastery. One being Fear and Greed. It's a daily business podcast, which is produced or co-produced and co-created and sometimes hosted by Adam Lang, our guest on this show. The other one is the Mumbrella Cast, which is the podcast that Mumbrella puts out as well. It's a really, really good deep dive into all things under the media marketing umbrella. What I like about it, and what I have said on many occasions, is that it's not just the headlines, it's really good, insightful, deep analysis. And the whole purpose, as Adam has shared, is it's about making you better at your job. It gives you great competitive intelligence, it gives you great insight, it gives you a good broad awareness of what is happening in the sector. So it's a must listen for anyone working in the Australian market, both of which are linked in the show notes. So I would encourage you to absolutely click on it, follow both of those podcasts as well. The final thing, which is a third plug, and I know I'm sending you off in all different directions, but if you find me annoying on this podcast, you are going to find me even more annoying on LinkedIn. But it is where you need to connect with me to help submit listener questions, to help kind of suggest different topics, different guests, to find out when new episodes have been released. And also, I do a little bit of a daily post Monday to Friday, something to do with media sales, just a kind of quick tip or a quick insight or a quick thought. And I really enjoy doing it. So I kind of see it as a bit of an extension of what I do here on the pod and vice versa. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. That is in the show notes too. And I think between my LinkedIn, this podcast, Fear and Greed of Mumbrella, you should have plenty of audio entertainment and some different things that you can kind of get into your LinkedIn feed. So I'm going to leave it at that. Get back to the episode with Adam now. It's funny, reflecting on what you're just saying, like when I was in Adelaide for a couple of years there, was really interesting working in radio. Very fortunate to have the number 1 station by a pretty considerable margin.
Healthy margin.
And what was actually a very healthy margin. What was interesting was how hard that actually was as the market leader and the price leader from a trading and rate perspective, because we had a radio station that would sell out, and we had a customer base that was at that point in time very, very price driven. And what was interesting working through that was exactly what you said, which was it's not necessarily about just trying to win all revenue, great and small. What we actually had to do there was go, okay, in fairness, and this is not arrogance, there is a section of the market that we probably shouldn't be playing in. We shouldn't be playing with these smaller transactional clients that are rate driven, because one, we don't want to be sort of coming in and having to slash our rate card to a price point that they would accept. And 2, we don't necessarily have to. We've got a premium product here, and we've got certain clients in this market that have a high price tolerance or are willing to pay for the value. So let's just focus on that. So sometimes that can be a big part of it too, is just maybe that mindset of I need to win every available dollar. It's like, not necessarily. You need to ideally try and align to those customers who actually are willing to pay for what it is that you're offering, and be comfortable to let some of the other stuff fall by the wayside.
I think the maximum value your audience is true in all sorts of ways. And so, those stations, when you're in the privileged position of having earned that sort of reach, where you're, being able to communicate with lots of people, that there are some shows and environments where you really should be paying a lot to reach that scale. It is metaphorically in Adelaide, you're standing in the middle of Adelaide Oval, filling it, on the average, say, breakfast show. That's how many people are listening at any point in time. And so when you think about it that way, paying a low rate to access that audience is not a sustainable business model. So you've got to be able to value that audience in every way, both the creative message that you're reaching, who's listening, why, how the brands connect, and also in the price. That is entirely relevant. You'll also have different parts of the day where you can bring in clients who can't afford that rate. Every session, every hour, sometimes every break, depending on the time of the day, can be different. But typically, you get an audience, say, with nighttime radio that is really interesting. Lots of different audiences coming in and out as, say, they habitually finish dinner, go about the rest of their evening, television maybe, phone maybe, listen to the radio alongside it. And who's paying attention at what amounts of time? And those sorts of areas can be so useful to test and learn the advertising and rates that can work for an audience. And you can use that environment in a really intelligent way for both you and the client, so that by the time you get onto that main stage, metaphorically, you've been able to afford it, you've been able to understand the reason why, and it'll work, right? So you've been able to grow that path. So, I know, Jamie, you love your music. Not everyone's fresh and ready for Broadway or the big stage of Coachella right from the beginning, right? You've got to develop those pathways. And, I think in radio, come back to valuing the audience that is there in every way. And I understand that this comes down to the mechanics of price, right? And it does come down to that instrument at the end, which articulates so many things. The value a client is willing to pay, the value the media operator is willing to sell it at. But I think the media operator has to really understand its audience and value the audience for the client so they know where to invest and how.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, I think this is sort of interesting thinking about that from the point of view of what is that inventory I have that is off peak or isn't that high demand, and how do you either incorporate that into an overall value proposition? How do you use it to offset some of the premium you might have to protect in other products or day parts? And interestingly, what are some cool applications for it? Like, I can remember, in the radio days, the vast wasteland of mid-dawns. I remember I had a rep who came across a couple of companies that did blackout blinds. So, basically would advertise to all the shift workers overnight to black the sun out. This one's a little bit sadder, but it was on the weekends. He found a dating agency. So he thought, Saturday morning and Sunday morning are times where people are probably pretty lonely. I'm going to put all this dating agency's ads on the weekend.
What a great idea.
So, there's some cracking ideas. And again, sometimes I think, it's about that whole idea before. It's not about, you could make an overnight spot as cheap as you humanly want. If a client doesn't feel an interesting application, or if they don't see utility, they're not going to value. But if you can match it to something that's novel, that works for the client, suddenly it's going to inherently have a value. So a lot of this isn't about necessarily the individual price. It's about creating the value proposition and then attaching a price to that is commensurate with what you're doing. Here's the one thing though, Adam, I wanted to ask you. You touched on it before. With all this stated, right, around driving yield up, around protecting rate integrity, adding value, what about the opposite of that? What are some scenarios where price might be a lever? When can we use price to our advantage?
So, look, I think it's to state the obvious and acknowledge the situations that are not ideal. If you, as a media operator, finding that your audience has decreased sustainably, then you really have to revalue your audience, right? So let's just say a media operator changes brands, changes people, changes programming, all sorts of things are relevant. This has to work both ways to have credibility. For example, if you bring sport into the schedule, you might just have it for winter or summer or both, but then it may come off. Let's say as the winter sports finish, that, say, many hours on weekend afternoons and nights and so on are a different property. That carries a different rate. And so you've just got to value that audience accordingly. And it really comes back to, I guess, to touch on the examples that you just gave, Jamie, around Sunday mornings and overnights. That's just clever. I think to value that audience, okay, again, going back to not just the numbers in an Excel spreadsheet that might, hey, this demo is listening at this time and so on, But what are they doing when they consume that content? What sort of content is it? Speaking on behalf of lots of different media brands, when you're reading, watching, listening, what are they doing as they do this? Where are they? What mindset are they in? And how can I reach them best? And valuing that. So yes, absolutely, the lever is on the scale of the audience you reach and the way in which you reach them. There has to be not just the scale, but the context of that consumption. And how's your brand going to connect in there? So coming back to your question on price, you bet prices must go up and down. It can't all head north all the time. That's just not reality. That's
a really good way of summing up this topic, that price is in fact a lever to drive business growth, but it can be used both ways. No one's saying that discounting or selling something that's heavily price incentivized at the right time isn't actually the right thing to do. Here's what I find interesting, and I've been doing this, obviously, to your point, been doing this a long time. I've worked for a couple of different types of publishers. I do have to call out Media. I don't know if this was a firm business rule, but something I observed, which I thought was really interesting in their pricing team, is that everyone who worked in that pricing team had done at least 3 years in a sales role before they moved into pricing. Whether that was by design, whether that was a business rule, or that was just a consequence of that team at the moment in time, it was really interesting seeing people come from being frontline sellers and then make that transition into the pricing function. Because I have to admit, mate, that's where a lot of process conflict, in my estimation, arises in the clients I deal with in my current role and in the businesses I've worked in the past, that push and pull of pricing and sales. What are some of the ways, in your estimation, when you were running yield and inventory teams, when you were a CEO, what were some of those ways that price conflict, process conflict would manifest with sales? And importantly, what were some of the behaviors you saw from media salespeople who managed this relationship well? What were they doing to get those outcomes and to keep that harmony, but still obviously get what they needed for the client?
So I think the first step was to make it part of your routine to review pricing all the time. So whether it was, say, television, radio, print, or online, there are audience metrics, right? So you get those. And it was part of the process that I've recommended in the past, is that you review it all the time, up, down, sideways, because you've got to look at the audience you're reaching. It is an incredibly important part of the fabric of what any advertiser is buying. So yes, the numbers count. Also, of course, when you're making program changes, the context of how people are consuming your media changes. So on audience ratings, I know television ratings come through every morning, but you'd be looking at it every week and taking a really dynamic approach to, hey, how are we going with our programs, but also how are we selling? So you'd review the campaigns that had been and looking at the campaigns that were coming to ensure that they were situated well, right? That we had integrity behind the audiences that we were reaching. And if you had to make adjustments on that, like you wouldn't change a campaign price up that had already been booked. If the audience has come up or things have improved, fantastic, well done them. But if audiences were coming down and you could see that, you've got to have the sort of relationship internally where you go, hey, okay, there's a challenge here and a benefit there. How about if we look at reweighting some of these campaigns and indeed even repricing? And so that was part of a weekly review. In the radio environment, 8 surveys a year minimum. You could look at that audience data, progressively streaming online. Podcast downloads came into that mix. You could get a really live sense of the demand that you had, but you always knew what was selling, and you had to be able to look forward and go, okay, where do we need to incentivize, offset price rises and so on? And so really it's weekly is the way that I've done it in the past, and you have to have that relationship with your senior salespeople and over time with all salespeople to know that there's a rationality behind where this is coming from, that that there is a story and there is a building block of information that goes into pricing, including audience, including demand. and really being able to look after clients in that way. And progressively over time, it's a partnership with the sales team. Because if they are indeed incentivized not just to sell the maximum units possible, but to sell at the right rates, they know this benefits them. They know where price rises are coming. They know where they can offset those. They know how they can look after the client best. And then you work out how do you reweight things to make sure that everyone can still win. I must say, though, Jamie, when I was employed in these trades, they weren't common everywhere, these jobs. And I wasn't always seen with the friendliest disposition in many of these situations when people say, what do you mean you're putting up the price? I don't care that the rating's doubled. I still want to sell it at the same price. Well, we could do that, but we'll sell out. So what do you want to do? And you end up just you're becoming, I guess, an in-house negotiator. You have to sell to the salespeople on behalf of the business as to why this is a benefit to the client, to them, to the company. And again, coming back to the very beginning, you know that as a business, everybody has to make money or we don't survive. We do not thrive. So really I think I had to learn sometimes in full contact sessions, just, how to navigate the internal sell.
Oh, I mean, I've had my fair share of standing up screaming matches on the phone to pricing too, mate. So you're not alone there. But I think, you raise a couple of good points there. One, this idea of demand generation, right? Like that's the biggest thing about sales is that's ultimately what we are there to do. We're not there to just capture the opportunity that the market brings to us. Our job is to go and drive demand for our products and our services. And I think that's a massive thing to kind of almost kind of reverse and go, demand for your product is actually a great sales tool. It can allow you to have a narrative in market that you need to move quickly, that the station or the product is selling quickly, is filling up. You need to plan further ahead. Like being able to work really hand in hand with the pricing team with them being the advisor in an advisory capacity and you being able to relay some of that to market can actually be really handy. It can actually help you generate demand and it can help you have a more robust conversation. I only wish the cafe down the road from me had a better inventory management pricing strategy, Adam, because I go there a couple of times a week after my early morning gym session and they always seem to sell out of this one sandwich and then everything else is left over and they go, oh, we sell out of that one at 6 a.m. every week. And I always go, well, if you sell out of that sandwich every day at 6 a.m.,
how about
I would suggest you should make more of those. Yeah. Or I'll tell you what, charge 4 times as much, I'd probably pay it. Okay, listener question time and then we'll wrap it up.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
So we've got one from a listener. This was submitted on LinkedIn a little while ago. You can hear the angst in this. It's funny. We probably just answered this person's question, but I'm going to play it for you now.
Our trading team are growing our spot rates at the expense of revenue. We've missed team budget 3 months in a row while turning away multiple pieces of business that could have got us over the line. Here's the kicker. We had the inventory to sell. In most months, we only have a 70% fill rate. How do we fix this?
That's a interesting but not uncommon dilemma, I would say. What's your initial impression of that one?
Oh, wow. That's alarming. I think the business objective has to be to sell your inventory, right? And not to sort of point outside to other business models, but if you or endlessly do so, but just for the sake of illustration, if you are an airline, if you're a hotel, a cruise, there are forms of perishable inventory. Once they're gone, right? That's time, it's gone, and you cannot sell them again. So to go to where 70% full, to me, is a business challenge. And so I think for this question and the person that's authored it, that's a really good question, and it goes to the heart of running a successful business in media, because that is a challenge. If I could only make suggestions, who is the owner of that inventory? Who is the owner of the role that you can talk to? I always had kind of a routine that where if you came to a dispute with your direct manager and you could not resolve it, then I want both of you to come to me. and we'll arbitrate. And there should be no foul and no favour in that, right? No one should end up looking bad. That you should be able to bring in a genuine business problem that two people can't solve working together and escalate that to your next level manager, because it has to be resolved. The business isn't winning at this point. And so that has to be fixed. I think you have a person here that's obviously feeling that challenge at a very acute level. Hang on, I know that we can do better here and we're not. To me, if I was the owner or proprietor, operator of a business, I want to know that problem existed, and I'd want to be able to help to fix it without recrimination, just to say, okay, how can we make this better? So without being cliched, that is distressing, and it is a great opportunity to do better.
What's interesting about this, like reflecting on this question, which was asked some time ago, what I found is this reads like a technical fix, but I actually think it's an adaptive fix. Because the technical fix, we know what it is. It's we need to bring to the attention the fact that we've got a missed opportunity here, or there's a misalignment in our objectives and KPIs. Clearly, this yield team are doing what they should be doing, which is growing their average unit rate. Sales are clearly there going, well, no, the job's to hit our number. But the thing I think reading this, that I think would be the first step, would be these things can very quickly become hallway conversations, or they can become very emotional kind of conversations, and they can become quite heated. And actually, this is just very much about, have you got the documentation to support what you're saying here? Have you got a spreadsheet with all the business that potentially you've turned away? Have you documented how far apart you were from a rate perspective? Is this all backed up by correspondence? And are you having a sensible, grown up, respectful, professional conversation with those people? Or is this just sort of, are you venting to the wrong people here? And is this all becoming a bit subjective? That would probably just be my initial thoughts here too, is it might just be around not so much the fact we know the conversation needs to be had, but how do you have that conversation properly too?
Yeah, Jamie, it's so true. And I guess the reason I use the word distressing is, at the heart here, someone's asking you, and thereby us in this conversation, when they don't feel it's as easy or it's harder to ask someone and where they're working. And so they're actually after advice. And it's like, okay, well, clearly that says for whatever reason or set of reasons, this person's uncomfortable addressing it internally. And so I guess to them, know that this is a business challenge. It exists in all businesses, not just media, and it should be welcome. And I think to use some of Jamie's great advice, grab some data. And if you can't grab it, start asking questions. Show that humility and curiosity as to where you can find the information, because there might be something behind here more than you can see. But it's really a discover the source of the problem, but it is a problem. So I think the indicator you should take away is that you're probably onto something, and see if you can prove that theory with your colleagues. And when it becomes necessary, seek the chain of command for a respectful way of dealing with it. In the end, you could walk out of this set of conversations ideally feeling really proud of how you've handled yourself, that you haven't scorched a teammate in the process, and that the business now looks at you and going, hang on, this one's a keeper. They think like a business operator, and I really want them to stay working with us.
It's a great call, mate. And yeah, not to try and sell the dream too much here, but I think this type of commercial discussion is actually fantastic learning, right? It's the type of things that if you can start encountering these scenarios, if you're a frontline seller, but if you start identifying these little process conflicts, and that's what this is a misalignment in process. It's nothing more than that. But if you can start to lean into this and go, well, how do I navigate this? How do I solve this? How do I play this the right way? How do I use my influence? How do I use my EQ? Fantastic thing to learn. And I dare say this is the type of thing that's going to frequently arise throughout your career, particularly as you start to climb into more senior roles. It's only going to become more prevalent that you're fixing these types of issues.
So, Jamie, as you said earlier, and you called out O Media, that they took people who had sales experience into those inventory and pricing teams. This could be that person's destiny. This could be the sort of thing that as a career path for them. But I will say, when it comes to pricing, that is now like a C-suite level consideration. The operators of the business must be thinking this way, not just you. And so I echo everything Jamie said. He put it really well.
Oh, well, thank you, mate. No, I think it's this is the whole point of the podcast, right? Was to flush out these types of scenarios and to kind of give some level of real time, unfiltered kind of advice, because this stuff comes up a lot, and there is no textbook for how to handle this kind of stuff. But Adam, before we go, I'm going to sort of slightly divert into something else. I know it's only day one, mate, but what can we expect from Fear and Greed, and in particular, what can we expect from Mumbrella moving forward? What's the roadmap or the vision look like for 2024 and beyond? Okay,
so Fear and Greed, business news is our wheelhouse. We love it, and we pump out 30 podcasts a week under 3 titles: Fear and Greed, The Fast 5, which is 5 stories in 5 minutes, and How Do They Afford That, which is really a more practical guide to financial literacy. And so we have never done any paid marketing, Jamie. Isn't that abhorrent for a media brand? So we've only done the owned and the earned part. Guess what? We're going to start putting our money where our mouth is and start buying some media. Who would have thunk it? But, we're at a stage of business evolution now where that's investing in our growth. And on Mumbrella, I think it's, really back to the beginning of what I said, the introduction of the podcast. We should be covering everything under the umbrella of media and marketing. We should be a utility to every member of that audience, no matter whether they're in the media buying community, creative, communications and PR, or media operator themselves. We should help them do their job better. And I think that Australia's kind of competitive mindset, our business evolution, is that we should be good enough to take on the world and occasionally, and certainly aspire to lead it. And so we want to help our industry to do that, to lead the world. And so we should be providing the articles every day in the newsletter, in our website, in our events, in our podcasts. We should be reflecting that at every stage. And I want to be held to account for that. And so, if anyone wants to give us feedback, including you, Jamie, anytime, I know you're always welcome, we want to be living up to that brand promise. So I hope that gives you an answer to the question. It's really about winning and growth. Fear and Greed and Mumbrella, they operate on very different playing fields, but that's what we're doing with both of them.
Well, I've said it before. I think I said it to you when I first sent you a note on Fear and Greed. It's one of those things where I go, God, I wish I came up with that idea, which is probably the sincerest compliment I can give you is, damn, I wish that was my idea, because it's a cracker. I'm going to put a link to both podcasts in the show notes here. If anyone's not familiar, I'd highly encourage get that into your podcast mix as well. And Adam, as always, mate, just great to have you, great to have a chat, and I look forward to catching up with you when I'm next in Sydney for a bite to eat.
Well, I look forward to that, Jamie. Thank you for having me on your podcast. I listen to it. I really enjoy it, and I think you should be proud of the work you're doing.
Thank you, mate.
My pleasure.